fucking leave.
But like that's another thing, right? It was like, okay, so Gauss and Grendel, yeah, dual pack and whatnot. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool, you know.
No.
Two frames, that's
No.
neat, you know. I mean, why not? Okay,
No.
yeah, guys, next week, okay, they're ready, but they're gonna ship now. And then it was like, oh, right. By the way, only Gauss now. They're not gonna ship together. For
But it's okay though.
no
They're still
reason.
besties.
Yeah, they're still
You know what-
besties though.
You
And
know what
like,
you know what they also fucked up on? They specifically said that Grendel and Gauss were gonna have some kind of synergy.
Yeah.
No.
What's the synergy exactly?
One's fat and one's skinny.
It's not the
Oh,
same.
right, here we go.
That's their synergy.
No, it's not. They said there were gonna be some kind of like synergy between the two frames, and it never materialized, and I hate them for it.
The next station will be Fortuna 69.
I'm by no means the first person to even think up the idea of having different warframes be able to interact with each other in a more meaningful way besides a handshake. The mere idea of allowing warframes to essentially fuse their powers together has the potential to be both fun in terms of creative potential and useful in terms of actual gameplay mechanics. Naturally, when I say gameplay mechanics, most of you would imagine that merely asking DE for interactive warframe powers would be outside of the realm of possibility, which it is, and that it would entail a lot of balancing and tweaking to ensure that it's as bug-free as possible, which it wouldn't be, because much like basically anything else in the game, having something with a shitload of bugs is funny the first time you experience it, but after the second, third, and eventually 24th time, it gets annoying to say the absolute minimum. However, if by some sheer stroke of luck DE decides to add cooperative warframe abilities to their ever-expanding list of shit to put in the game over the next 10 years, I imagine that it would be broken down into 3 categories: offensive, defensive, and utility. For the sake of simplicity, I'll start with offensive. Like the name implies, offensive ability interactions would be intended to nuke everything in sight, which on paper seems rather pointless given that warframes such as Equinox and Mesa exist, but in practice I imagine would allow lesser played warframes such as Hydroid or Ember to see greater usage if they possessed a powerful combination power, quote-unquote. As example, let's take Frost and Mag. Suppose that if Mag used her magnetize ability on a crowd of enemies, Frost becomes able to cast Freeze on the bubble in order to apply additional effects to it. Doing so would cause enemies within the bubble to become brittle, causing them to lose a portion of their armor every time they take damage. Additionally, if Mag were to use her Crush ability while this effect is active, the damage from Crush would be doubled against enemies under the brittle effect. As another example, let's use Hydroid and Volt. Suppose that Hydroid turned into a puddle with his Undertow ability. Volt would then have the ability to either cast Shock onto Hydroid in order to increase his movement speed as well as increase the damage enemies take while in Undertow, or Volt could cast Discharge while standing on top of Hydroid in order to cause electrified water to splash in all directions, causing enemies to take increased damage from Discharge while also stunning any enemies who enter the area. There are several examples of this type of offensive interaction that any player ever could come up with. But the point is that having abilities be allowed to interact with each other would be best utilized on warframes that are not considered meta. Giving this type of interaction to warframes that are frequently utilized such as Chroma, Mesa, or Saren would possibly only increase their overall damage and/or potency in-game, and that's a type of power creep that I think could be easily avoided. If unpopular warframes are ever to receive synergy with each other, then their combined result should be something powerful enough to consider actually being used in organized play, because obviously random public squads would never use something like this. Now for defensive. The purpose of defensive ability interactions would primarily be to protect or lock down a given area, instead of merely killing enemies outright. This type of interaction would see lesser usage considering that Warframe is more about killing than about actually completing objectives, but I do think that non-offensive interactions would see some usage. However, because defensive ability interactions wouldn't deal nearly as much damage as their offensive counterparts, this category of power combination would be fine if every Warframe received one in some form. As an example, let's use Mirage and Limbo. If Mirage's Prism ability were active, suppose that Limbo becomes able to cast Banish on the Prism itself. Doing so would reduce the energy drain of Mirage's Prism by 50%, and it would immediately banish enemies into the rift instead of blinding and damaging them. Obviously this change to Prism would really only work if Limbo is smart enough to have his stasis ability active beforehand, but that only highlights how players would have to communicate with each other in order to make the most of something like this. For another example, I'll bring up Frost and Ember. Suppose that if Ember casts Inferno and Frost casts Avalanche at the same time, the explosion of ice and fire would release large clouds of steam which would deal reduced damage but be able to blind all enemies within the area for a moderate amount of time. Transitioning from damage to crowd control would basically be useless against standard enemies, but if a team is trying to play the long game, whether it be grinding for over an hour or simply doing a very long survival session, crowd control at this point would take a bigger precedence than damage. Lastly, I'll talk about utility interactions. Utility interactions would deal no damage themselves, instead offering some other effect that could either be combined with another Warframe ability or merely a simple non-damage affliction. As an example, let's use Zephyr. Once Zephyr casts her Tornado ability, suppose that all Warframes could jump into the tornado itself and be able to hover like Zephyr can. However, remaining inside the tornado would grant 100% evasion for the entirety of the tornado's duration, but no more than one player may be in a tornado. Additionally, Titania gains increased movement speed and evasion for a limited time if she flies into one of Zephyr's tornadoes. Octavia could throw one of her rollerballs into a tornado to increase its movement speed, and Vauban could throw one of his non-Tesla abilities in order to make it mobile. Although that's a very crude example, the overall point is that even on their own, Warframe ability should have the potential to be combined with other tools in the game, similar to how Zephyr's tornado can already be shot at with elemental weapons in order to modify its damage. Given that DE has a lot on their plate at the moment with Railjack hotfixes and still having to develop the new war as well as the Plains of Duviri, I'm fairly certain that ability interactions are an absolute impossibility in the short term, but not in the long term. Thank you for watching.